a debate between Vincent David of the Spartacist League, Mike Macnair of CPGB, on who is the working class and why does it matter strategically. The running order is 25 minutes, 25 minutes each as introductions. Vincent, I believe, is starting, if you want to go ahead.
Just a second to change some settings.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, perfect. This is a first for me on doing on Zoom. So anyway, I hope it'll go fine. Just give me a second. Right, okay. Well, thank you very much for organizing this debate. I am sorry not to be able to be with you at the Communist University. I hope next year, hopefully. I'm often gone in August. Anyway, so I'm happy at least to be able to debate through Zoom. I wanted to open with a point from the get-go. I did not really agree with the title of this debate. It was chosen without my consultation. So the title obviously is "Who's the Working Class and Why Does It Matter Strategically?" For me, the reason I did not agree is because I didn't thought that this subject actually reflected the disagreement Mike Macnair and myself have had a few months ago in the pages of the Weekly Worker, and the fundamental point we were debating. For me, there is a point like the CPGB prides itself to be for communist unity, for democratic discussion, which I obviously is something we in the Spartacist League agree with as well. But for me, that does also involve that we should agree on what we're debating exactly. Now, I will touch a little bit about who is the working class in my presentation, but that's not going to be necessarily the focus of my of necessarily all my points here. Because for me, a discussion, a debate purely on the question of who is working class, who's not, always risk being quite academic, quite abstract, and really this has to be really tied to the question of what strategy toward the working class and what is to be done today. So, what is the actual controversy between Mike Macnair, Comrade Mike Macnair, and I, which I salute, by the way? For me, the controversy is quite simple, actually. If you follow the pages of the Weekly Worker, you'll know we had a series of exchange earlier this year. And the controversy for me is, should small communist organizations adopt an orientation towards the working class, consciously send their members in working class jobs, and should communists seek to play a leading role in the day-to-day struggles of workers? We in the Spartacist League say yes, and Comrade Macnair disagrees. And that is, for me, the debate between our respective tendencies. This controversy really arose earlier this year around the fusion of the Spartacist League Australia in Australia with the Revolutionary Communist Organization, which is now called Communist Unity. And at its Congress earlier this year, our comrades had put forward a proposal for Communist Unity to aim to have 50% of its membership in working class job. So this was a modest proposal, which was aimed at building really a more proletarian, working class oriented organization. And this is what triggered our exchanges, with Comrade Macnair characterizing our proposal as crap and syndicalist quakery. Now, throughout this debate, and to my great pain and disappointment, I feel that Comrade Macnair has often sought to divert the discussion on various other subjects. I believe, for me, the title of this debate today is, for me, another example of steering the discussion in another direction, although not completely unrelated. So we can talk endlessly about who is a worker, but really for this discussion to be useful, it has to be about what strategy really for the working class, as I said. So why does the Spartacist League insist on this point about going to the working class, sending people to the working class? And for us, it's quite straightforward. The communist movement, at least in most of the Western world today, is really divorced from the working class. In Britain, there are no sectors of the working class in which communists have any real influence. And I mean by this, like actual roots and support within the working class, within working class communities, trade unions, etc. Um, and rather, the bulk of the communist movement today in Britain, uh, but this point applies in many other countries, is made up largely of middle class layers, petty bourgeois elements, students, academics, retirees, D-class intellectuals, etc. Really often who tend to be divorced from the struggles and preoccupation of the working class. I'm not saying that there are no workers, obviously, but overwhelmingly the left is based in general in middle class layers. And this was not always the case, by the way. Before the fall of the Soviet Union, the socialist movement in general had a much bigger influence in working class layer. And so the fact that the communist movement today is based in large part in middle class layers has a direct impact in the outlook of the movement and organizations, in their program, ideology, who have in the last years and decades become really influenced by petty bourgeois politics as opposed to working class politics. Um, so, for example, groups today like the Revolutionary Communist Party have a conscious orientation exclusively on campuses to recruit students. And they have a conscious policy of avoiding doing serious work in the working class and in the trade unions. And this really creates a huge problems for the Revolutionary Communist Party. It means that their cadres are not trained in the class struggles. They are very well read, I'll give them that, but they are not building a communist proletarian organization. That's not the aim of what they're doing. Um, I would even argue that groups like the Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, or the CPB, who have a strong presence in the unions, are also, in my opinion, divorced from the working class, in the sense that most of their work happens in the echelons of the union bureaucracy, supporting different union bureaucrats, with actually very little support for their politics among the rank and file. For me, an example that comes to mind is the recent election in Unite, where the Socialist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party both campaigned for Sharon Graham, amid widespread apathy among Unite members for her. She has presided over a series of defeat. She's a totally pro-imperialist union leader, and she won the leadership of the union again, but on a 10% turnout. As I said, with a lot of apathy within the union. So I believe that even though they do a lot of work in the union, I believe a lot of their work is actually divorced from the real sentiment of the rank and file of the union. And because of years of betrayal by union bureaucrats and labor right politicians who often receive the support of a part of the socialist left, what we're seeing right now, and there's a huge chunk of the working class which is turning to the right, to reform, to restore Britain, to Tommy Robinson, etc. I mentioned in one of my letters to Comrade Macnair that I believe today Tommy Robinson has much more traction particularly among manual workers, than any left-wing labor-right politician you can think of. And that is a new development we have to deal with, and it is really a product of a sort of backlash against the liberal left, which often has been tailed by the socialist left. And so this is really the biggest strategic problem, according to us, the Spartacist League, the communist movement face. The movement is divorced from the working class, and too often imbued with liberal ideology, which actually reinforce this dynamic. And the bulk of the working class, particularly among manual workers in manufacturing sector, transport, etc., are turning to the right as the only sort of alternative or pole of opposition against the status quo. So it's in this context, and you have to understand this context as to why the Spartacist League fights for a conscious orientation towards the working class, and sort of consciously away from middle class circles, even away from campuses and petty bourgeois layer. This does not mean we ignore those layers, that we're against campus work. Not at all. We do some of it. However, we do insist that if the communist movement is to have a chance to once again become a relevant force among the working class, if it is to influence the course of the class struggle, well, we must be in the working class and do serious work within it. Of course, contrary to what Comrade Macnair has argued. We do not think that this will solve all our problems. We do not think this is a talisman. Work in the working class bring its own pressure, its own difficulty. It's very difficult, yet it is essential. The communist movement cannot grow separately from the working class movement. So yes, we strongly encourage our members, but generally leftists in general to who want to be communist to particularly if they are from a more middle class backgrounds to go into the working class and find a job there. Even a small group with a solid implantation can make a difference in the course of the class struggle. But more broadly, getting into the working class is also how young people can be steeled into communist fighters. This is how they can learn discipline. We wrote an article in the latest issue of our newspaper called Women in Revolution, precisely making the case as to why young people should rather than going into careers in academia or white collar jobs, which are kind of in a crisis right now. There's not much future for this except being racking up massive student debt. It's better to become electrician, plumber, carpenter, or even going into nursing and even teaching, and get in a position where you can play an active part in the rebuilding of the trade union movement in Britain and beyond. For us, the rebuilding of the union is one of the key tasks of the communist movement. Trade unions are extremely hollowed out in Britain. I'm not going to get into this, but for us, this is really, really key, a key task for communists. So what have been Macnair's Comrade Mike Macnair counter arguments throughout this various debate? Could I? I'll try to summarize some of them. Comrade Macnair, you can correct me if I'm not summarizing them properly. The main argument that really comes up on and on from Comrade Macnair is that many groups have tried what he calls colonization, like sending a lot of people in industries, and it has often ended in failure, or else these groups have degenerated while doing this. And for me, this is really not an argument. Various groups fail in establishing a sustained presence in industry or degenerated really due to political mistakes, due to a wrong political orientation in the period, which is really key and important. And it's true that going into the working class does not dispense of the need to have a correct political orientation. But the reason of degeneration, Comrade Macnair speaks a lot about his experience in the IMG, I believe. I'm no specialist of this, and I'm not going to get into the IMG, but the reason why these groups degenerated has to be found in political programs and mistake, and not so much in the fact that they sought to integrate into the working class. It's really a wrong conclusion, I think, to say, well, because some tried industrialization, we must renounce industrialization as a whole. By the logic of this argument, we should probably renounce socialism, because there's been so many organizations created for the purpose of fighting for a socialist revolution, who most of them have ended up degenerating and in failure. Does that mean we renounce socialism? Of course, we do not. Another argument against the perspective we've been pushing is that fighting really focusing on the day-to-day struggle of workers, sending communists there and really doing activism on the shop floor, really, which is often economic, leads to economism. That it's like the reduction of the communist program to mere bread and butter issues, which I think the CPGB would maybe argue is like the abandonment of the political action. Again, I believe this is false. Putting communists into factories and workplaces is how you raise class consciousness of the working class, not lower it. So we go into the working class to build the union movement through struggle against the union bureaucracy. We seek really to initiate and guide struggles and show in action really the dead end of laborism, of the union bureaucracy, of reformism more generally, and really demonstrate in action the superiority of a Marxist program in charting a way forward for workers, starting really with the most immediate economic demands. And this isn't economism, because it is a struggle which is always directed against the union bureaucracy and always keeping in mind the final goal of working class power. Comrade Macnair also argued that what we need rather is to build a communist party. And that's often an argument we have with comrades also of communist unity or others. Like, there's this counterposition between the day-to-day struggle of workers and the building of the communist party. And our view that we need to sink roots into the proletariat, sending communists there, is often described as a form of syndicalism, which I think Macnair said so explicitly, sort of bypassing the need for political action. I'm sorry, but this argument is quite ridiculous. I have to be frank. What other ways is there to build a working class communist party, if not by showing to the working class in action how workers need a communist party and a communist program to advance their interests, to better their lives? That's how the communist movement can become a force among the working classes, by showing that you need communism, showing to workers that you need communism to advance your own interests. You cannot build a communist party in isolation of the day-to-day struggles of the working class. And the whole history of the communist movement shows this. I have to say, I'm quite astonished by that Comrade Macnair disputed my simple assertion that I made in a letter that every communist organization that went from a sect, like a small group, to a mass factor, did so by winning over key sectors of the working class, by really sinking roots in it. Even the German SPD, which is very dear to the CPGB, became a force because it built the German workers' movement from scratch. Building trade unions, leading strikes, as well as political campaigns, but which were directly affecting and connected with the lives of the working class. If you study the history of any communist party that became a factor in the history of the communist movement, you will find that it is really by leading struggles in the working class that they were able to become a rallying pole, actually, in the working class movement. And the idea that there's a strict separation between the day-to-day problems and struggles of workers, who are often economic, and the general communist program is really a repudiation of Marxism as the program developed to emancipate the working class. And the task of communists is really to make that connection between the day-to-day struggle of workers and the need for communism, for a socialist revolution, all the more obvious. But if communists are not in the working class, are not having a conscious orientation to fight within the struggles of workers, well, that connection is severed. Okay, this brings me to the question of the barista. I'm sure many CPGB comrades are probably ready to attack me on the question on the barista, because in one of my letters, I argued that baristas are not part of the industrial working class, but rather the lower levels of the petty bourgeoisie, because they work in small coffee shops. To be clear, like, most baristas are totally exploited, doing backbreaking work and often low pay. And baristas are often, some of them, from working class backgrounds, and workers at Starbucks, Costa, Bread, etc. They desperately need a union, and we in the Spartacist League unconditionally support any effort in that direction, and did so on the ground actually sometimes. So why did I say that on the baristas? It's not so much about the baristas themselves, actually. It is rather how the example of the baristas is often used by CPGB supporters and others to deny the need to orient towards specifically the industrial working class, these sectors of the proletariat who works in socialized industry. I'll explain myself a little bit. Comrade Macnair defends the view that anyone who receives a wage is a proletarian. That's what the claims Marx argued. And according to this view, almost everyone is a worker, from a highly paid university professor to a solicitor to an Amazon delivery workers to a barista, etc. And from that definition, I would add that even a screw or police officers could be workers. I'm curious to know if the CPGB thinks that screws or police are workers. We certainly don't. Anyway, that's sort of a sidetrack, because they all receive a wage. I'm aware that in his later response, Comrade Macnair did clarify that he didn't consider, highly paid solicitors as workers or university professors. So I understand that. But this is a bit of a contradiction, because at the same time, Comrade Macnair insists that everyone who receives a wage is a worker. And so what's the problem with this? It's because a conception like that actually deny the need for communists to orient specifically to the industrial working class, to the part of the class which occupies a strategic role in the capitalist economy and whose collective power can really break the capitalist class, but also whose situation really creates a particular consciousness. I'm sorry, but there is a difference in outlook, in methods of struggles, and in consciousness between a construction worker, a railroad worker, a docker, an Amazon worker, and between a well-off office workers or between a barista. The reason why baristas are so hard to organize, and this is true actually for many retail and low paid service jobs, is because they are isolated in small shops with a workforce that changes a lot. And without the support of broader logistic workers, distribution sectors, and without classical methods, obviously, it's very hard to unionize this layer. And I think if we're going to talk about baristas, I think it's much better to talk about uh, what are the obstacles, the challenges to their unionizations, rather than discussing abstractly, are they worker, are they not worker? I don't know. So really the point I wanted to clarify with this point on barista, which has been used in the publicity for this event, is because it's always raised as an argument against having a conscious orientation towards industry, towards the part of the proletariat which works in socialized industry. So um, uh, today the communist movement is weak, and as I explained, really divorced from the working class. And really, this is how to understand our position in the Spartacist League, our particular emphasis on the need to really send communists into the working class. Also as a way to undercut the growing support for Reform UK inside the working class. There's a recent poll that came out which said that the Labour Party and Reform UK are neck and neck among the working class. And particularly when you go to more manual sectors, you will see that this is where Reform UK gets a lot of its support. If you go to the Birmingham bin strike picket line, Reform UK is the most popular party. So for us to refuse to have really a strong position, to refuse to send communists into industry, to try to be a factor into those layers of the working class, is really an abdication of the most important task. And I think the logic of this position is to leave the working class either to the right, as I just explained, or to the union bureaucracy, which sabotages its struggle, which constantly disorganized the trade union movement. The Reds communists have to be there. I'll conclude briefly. The what sort of bothers me as well in the different exchanges we have, and maybe Comrade Macnair can fill the gap in his own presentation, is that Comrade Macnair agrees that today communists are marginal in the working class, and he still argues strongly against our proposal. Yet I have not heard really a single proposal from Comrade Macnair or the CPGB to how can we break that isolation of the communist movement and the working class. What should be our strategy? Of course, we agree that there's no quick fix solution. I'm not arguing here that sending a few communists in the working class is going to solve everything, but at least we're trying to chart a way and break this isolation in this way. So you can argue against my position that communists should consciously go to the working class, which I frankly think is such a basic position. But you do have a responsibility to explain then what do you propose rather? Because for me, if communists can find their way to construction workers, to railway workers, but also to these vast layers of workers who are on 0-hour contracts, on this vast subcontracting network, we're very conscious in the Spartacist League that the working class today is not the same as it was, 50 or 100 years ago. But if we can't reach those layers, really, we're not worthy of the name communists. And as the communist movement was born as the movement of the working class, specifically of the modern industrial working class, this is where we must seek support. And I would make a point more broadly also about the global South, where the vast majority of the proletariat is now located. We in the Spartacist League have also a conscious orientation to try to shift away from the Western world and try to look to the proletariat in the global South. Anyway, I'm not going to get into this because it's a bit outside the topic of this talk, but I think this is also key. So we in the Spartacist League were very small, yet we seek really to provide an example of what needs to be done. In Britain, we're small, but we have only started to do serious work in the unions recently, following our reorientation in 2023, where we changed a lot of our conceptions for those who don't know. We have tiny connections in Unison, the NAU, RMT Unite. It's very small, yet our goal there is really to build caucuses, groupings inside the union, which can really lead struggles, even the most minimal ones, and really organize a struggle against the union bureaucracy. One of our supporter has been playing a leading role, for example, in seeking to merge the union in his workplace, organize cleaners, in the NAU, one of our supporters has made multiple, modest campaign in her own workplace, for example, against managers being part of the unions, etc. If you follow our press in the United States, where we have a much a bigger organization, we do consistent work in the dockers unions on both coasts, in the transit unions, among teachers, hospital workers, etc. And our goal is always the same here: put forward a strategy to fight and win against the union bureaucracy, and show in this way why Marxism is essential for worker. And I'll conclude on one brief point. At bottom, I believe the disagreement between Comrade Macnair and myself, or the CPGB and the Spartacist League, is about method. If your goal is to build purely an electoral vehicle, or quote unquote political vehicle, just in general, then focusing on the industrial workers doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to make a distinction between particular layers of the proletariat in industry, in socialized production. And then the conception that anybody can be a worker kind of makes sense. But if your goal is to influence the class struggle, to build an organization which can directly intervene in the class struggle, shape the class struggle in favor of the working class, then you see how it actually matters to focus on certain key strategic sector of the working class. Even if the working class is a minority of the population, like it is in Britain, it is key. So for me, this is the distinction, I think, between the CPGB and the Spartacist League. We seek to create a class struggle organization that can really guide, initiate, and hopefully one day lead, instances of class struggle and shape the working class movement in this way. And I believe this is, I think, the fundamental difference between us. So, and for me, this also explains why the proposal of that we had at the RCO of trying to send 50% of their members into working class jobs initiated such an opposition from Comrade Macnair. Like, why would you be so opposed to such a basic proposition? I don't know how much time I have left, but I think I might leave it here for now, and we can see what the discussion brings up. But I believe this is an important question, so I'm looking forward to the debate.
I start with a point of agreement. I agree that the communist movement is largely isolated from the working class. That's true on any definition of the working class. The communist movement, the far left, I shall say the far left, it's actually rather better, because, for example, the PCF in France still has substantial working class presence, and so on. Other examples exist. But the far left is isolated from the working class, has a strong tendency to recruit primarily on campuses, and so on. The question is, secondly, this is a problem. I agree that this is a problem. I don't agree that this is a problem which is to be in any sense solved by saying, let's send comrades into industry. And I don't agree with the idea that winning industry is going to result in decisive victory in the class struggle. Just as a single example of winning industry leads to decisive victory in the class struggle, the old Communist Party of Great Britain for a time had the leadership of the electricians' trade union, which theoretically gave them power over the whole of electrical power. The upshot of that, of course, was that the state intervened and got rid of the Communist Party leadership of the electricians' union, and the leadership of the electricians' union has since then been firmly in the hands of hard right pro-capitalist forces. So what lies behind that is the problem of politics, that the workers' movement will not win factory by factory, industry by industry, victory by seizing the strategically central industries. More generally, however, it's not new. The isolation of the far left, the Trotskyists, the left communists, and from the 1960s, the Maoists, from the core sections of from sections of industrial unionism, that's been continuous since the 1930s. There are exceptional examples. Teamsters in Minneapolis, they're a very bad example from Comrade Vincent David's example, because the Teamsters are precisely guys, they're truckers, guys who worked in small workplaces, who are organised on a district basis, not on a shop-by-shop basis. From the town where I come, the town where I come from, Oxford, had a Trotskyist leadership in the car plant in Cowley Assembly, major car factory between the early 1960s and the early 1980s. That leadership wasn't in fact achieved by, certainly wasn't achieved by the Socialist Labour League sending colonists into Cowley. It was achieved by the Socialist Labour League in the wake of the Hungarian events of 1956, winning a branch of the Young Communist Party, of the Young Communist League away from support for the Communist Party. But these episodes, I've given examples, these episodes are episodes, no more than episodes. The Socialist Workers' Party's influence in the Teamsters Union brought down on their heads the full-scale intervention of the US capitalist state to hand over the leadership of that union to gangsters. It was conscious intervention of the capitalist state to do that. That's not saying you don't fight for union leadership. It's not saying you don't fight struggles. It's just saying without confronting the question of the state and the question of politics and general laws and electoral representation, there is not a way to overcome the problem of isolation. In the UK, we have a peculiar situation. I don't think it's unique, but it's largely peculiar, which is that the Communist Party of Great Britain has been reduced to among the ranks of the Trotsky, not the Communist Party of our Communist Party, the Communist Party of Britain, sorry, the Morning Star Group, has been reduced to an organisation of the size of the Trotskyist sects. So, why this is a problem is also about why the problem is there. First off, the working class is the social class, the whole social class, men and women, children and pensioners, dependent on the wage share of output. It's dependent on the wage share of output. That means earning a wage and or indirectly living off the wage as of homemakers and of children and pensions. But the wage share of output, economic output falls to be divided into the wage share, which pays for the collective labourer, that is to say, the whole reproduction cost of the labour power necessary to set in motion the capitalist economy. You can't analyse it in any other way, because the reality is that people move in and out of employment, people move from employment to employment. Holding wages down to a level at which profitability takes place involves the maintenance of a layer of unemployed. If there's no social welfare arrangements, the unemployed starve to death. The labour market gets so tight that capitalists can't make a profit. So social welfare arrangements, it's a tendency for us to imagine that social welfare arrangements are new. They're already in existence in England, old poor law from the 1590s onwards, in Venice, Genoa, other Italian city-states from the late medieval period, in the Netherlands, again from the 16th century. So the wage share, therefore, is the share of the cost of reproduction of labour power, including equally the cost of education and training. The profit share, what the profit share is obvious. There is a rent share, which is the share of rent going to landed property, and the share of, and also includes the profit from property speculation. And there is an interest share, which also includes the share of financial speculation. And finally, a state share, which is much more limited than the actual tax spend, because an awful lot of the actual public spending is part of the wage share. Yeah, but the costs of the army and the police and so on and so forth, the state share. So the working class is the social class in the whole of society, which is dependent on the wage share. And this class actually is a majority. It's not a minority in British society, it's a majority in British society. It's not a large majority because it's sort of 57, 58% of the society, not much more than that. British society is largely financial parasitic financial, offshore financial centre with a moderately sized real economy, productive economy attached to it. And in consequence, it has very large unproductive layers. In particular, private, not state pensioners, and not private pensioners whose private pension is so small that they depend on state welfare. Those are part of the working class. But private pensioners like me, I've come out of an academic job, I'm on a private pension, I'm living on the investments made by the university superannuation scheme. That's income from capital. The working class needs collective organisation, and this is, as Comrade Vincent said, is just as much true of baristas and of cleaners. And indeed, we've recently had serious efforts at organising cleaners in London, and of people working in small shops. It was just as much true of the journeyman tailors of Cambridge, who in 1722 were prosecuted for conspiracy to raise wages, or the guys in the building trade, against whom the first anti-union law, the Confederacies of Masons Act 1415, first British anti-union law, was made against confederacies of masons to raise wages. Or again, 1730s, conspiracy to refuse to work more than 16 hours a day, to the great loss and damage of their employers. Those people who are conspiring are journeymen and apprentices working in small shops in those operations. The working class needs collective action because it is separated from the forces of production. And take the guys who work up the road from me in BMW Cowley. They build cars, but the engines are manufactured in Germany. So yeah, we're going to the workers will seize Cowley, and they won't be able to produce any cars because they won't be able to have any engines to produce the cars. In fact, actually equally true of the guys who work in the power stations, because the power stations need incoming supplies. So the working class needs collective organisation, and it's because the working class needs collective organisation that, in spite of all immense pressure against trade union organisation and strikes, trade union organisation and strikes keeps popping its head up. But it's not just that the working class needs collective organisation in the form of trade unions and strikes. Again, the Labour Party, there was a really serious effort around 2010 to get rid of the Labour Party and say we're going to have a two-party system of the Conservatives and the Liberals. We'll drive Labour into third place, and then it won't be worthwhile for the trade unions to back Labour, and they'll be willing to play footsie with the Liberal Party. In reality, actually, the working class in the towns turned out in large numbers to the point that they had real problems with the keeping the polling stations. There were queues to get into the polling stations in the inner city constituencies, and clegmania, the effort to drive the Labour Party into third place, was defeated. Equally, the fact that 800,000 people signed up that they were interested in the new Corbyn Party illustrated that pressure for collective organisation and collective political action. The working class needs a communist project, and it needs a communist project because as long as we accept that capitalism will exist, there is permanent pressure to reduce the wage share. That pressure to reduce the wage share may take the form of directly reducing wages, but it also takes the form, for example, we've right now got under cover of we want more skilled workers. We want to reduce the number of working class kids who go to universities. We want to reduce the extent to which the working classes are taught critical thinking, and instead that the working classes should be taught how to do this or that skill, manual skill better. The reality, of course, actually is that teaching manual skills in universities and colleges of further education is just attempting to save the employer training costs, and the training costs nonetheless recur. When you actually get to the job, it turns out that what you were doing in the CFE isn't that helpful for the brickie or the carpenter or whatever the hell it may be. So the capitalist class, because of we have to be told we need to reduce the wage share. It needs to be tax cuts. It needs to be public spending cuts. It needs to be, we need guns, not butter. We need to rearm and defend the country. We need to preserve the competitiveness of British industry. For all of these reasons, the working class needs collective organisation. And it needs collective organisation not only in the form of trade unions and industrial action, but also in the form of cooperatives, also in the form of workers' educational associations, also in the form of working class collectivist political parties, and struggles which are struggles over general laws. Marx, in the debate with the Bakuninists, Comrade Vincent's line is the line of the Bakuninists in 1869 to 1871. Marx's argument, working class needs political action in the form of general laws like the 10-Hour Day Act, maximum working hours legislation, the modest Magna Carta of the working class, and similarly general laws like the Factory Acts to secure the series of Factory Acts and Health and Safety Acts, and so on and so forth. And similarly, again, Marx argues it is a class struggle to get working class electoral representation. During 2015 through 2019, there was a massive class struggle taking effect in the Labour Party as to whether capital would retain direct control over the Labour Party or whether the working class could make the Labour Party, to some extent, an instrument in its own interest. It was a bit illusory to imagine that Corbynism would do that, but it was a mass illusion. It was an illusion of hundreds of thousands of people. That was a class struggle just as much as the anti-war movement or the strike actions or anything else. The workers' movement needs, therefore, a project beyond capitalism, because as long as you accept capitalism, you accept competition, you accept the wage share has to go down. Conversely, communism as a project needs that working class pressure for collective action. Why? It's not because the working class is in control, we occupy the factories and we can set them in motion. The reality, in order to set the factories in motion, you need not just the factories, but the farms, the mines, the whole complex structure of the economy. It's that communism needs collective action. Communism is precisely the laying collective hands on the whole of the economy. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the working class as a whole, Marx's expression in 1871, the political dominance of the proletariat as a class, can only happen through collective organisation. And it's in that sense that the trade unions, the cooperatives, the collectivist political parties foreshadow socialism, foreshadow the future cooperative commonwealth. Conversely, the form, the argument that Marx and co were largely concerned with in the late 19th century is that you can't have a socialism, a communism based on the artisan producers. Basically because the artisan producers have their own individual turf interests, fight each other, and in consequence don't in fact tend towards communism. It's the proletariat, because the proletariat doesn't have possession of means of production. A concrete example in the UK, the finance sector funded the dentists to bolt out of the National Health Service. Okay, what we've wound up with is private firms, all the little one-person dental practices have been bought up by private equity firms, and so we have it passes from individual ownership to oligopoly. The idea of socialism involves laying collective hands, and the more immediate converse thing is that the management equally. This is Marx again from the critique of Hegel's doctrine of the state. The state bureaucrats do not represent the general interest. No, they represent the individual turf interests of this bureaucrat in his turf, in his office, in his jurisdiction. I'm using his. Actually, I shouldn't be using his because now we've got lots of female bureaucrats. But that is actually just as much true and visible in the Soviet Union, visible equally in the collapse of your party, that of the Your Party project, that the individual officials have individual turf interests which are at the expense of everybody else. Okay, now we come inevitably to the point, why is the left divorced from the workers' movement? One, because it's splintered, because the working class needs unity. The working class objectively needs unity. Because it objectively needs unity, you go to whatever the hell factory you go to or workplace you go to, half a dozen different trot groups turning up with their own bulletins and their own papers and so on and so forth doesn't cut any ice. Conversely, and this is where Comrade Vincent's history is a complete fantasy, the actual unification. In Germany in 1875, two small groups, neither of them more than a few thousand, unified, and the small groups, neither of them more than a few thousand unifying, creates a mass organisation very quickly, and it's that mass organisation which attracts widespread support. It attracts widespread support not just because it's unity, but also actually because of Babel and Liebknecht taking a courageous stand in the Reichstag against the Franco-Prussian War and abstaining and going to jail for abstaining on the vote on war credits. But the same phenomenon has happened over and over again. The working class needs trade unions and it creates trade unions. It's not the party is not an instrument, it's not a general staff, it's not an instrument for directing the trade union struggle. That was Bakunin's invisible dictatorship. The party is an instrument for the political intervention of the working class in relation to electoral representation, in relation to the struggle for general laws in relation to the interests of the working class as a class, as opposed to sectional interests, and in relation to escaping from being a tail of the capitalist class in relation to foreign affairs. And because of that character, that has the consequence that the left groups are marginal. I add two other reasons why the left groups are marginal. One, the USSR, we still stand in the shadow of Stalinism, unavoidably. We have to overcome that. The issue which we have to overcome that, the only way in which we can overcome that, is by making it clear that we are not proposing to do Stalinism again. And that requires us to take very seriously unity in action and open discussion and against speech controls and bureaucratic centralism and all of that crap. Secondly, which is intimately related to this, Comrade Vincent, one which I agree with, the left tails the liberals. And in particular, it tails the liberals on the issue of speech controls. And by tailing the liberals on the issue of speech controls, the left identifies itself with the Human Resources Department, with the Personnel Department. This is the People's Front in operation. And we've got guys who come out of the Spartacist tradition, Alex Green and what was the other guy's name? Tony Collins. Going after the CPGB on the basis that we're in favour of accurately quoting Marx and Engels in relation to obnoxious word usage. What's that about? These comrades say that they're defending communism, the 21 conditions. What they're actually defending is the People's Front with the management, the alignment of the left with the management and the Human Resources Department. And in doing so, actually, they're actively promoting the separation of the movement of the left from the working class. This is the reverse, the opposite. It doesn't matter how much we send people into industry, and I've referred to the fact because I said that the same problem, it's been around since the 1930s. The left has tried, the far left has tried sending people into industry repeatedly, including the Sparts. It doesn't work because it doesn't address the actual problem, which is our own disunity, our lack of an orientation which is for the purpose of a party. That's it.
Okay, thank you to both speakers. We now have about 45 minutes for discussion. It's a guideline, not a hard and fast rule, but if you can keep it to 5 minutes, that'd be good. So, Tina and Jack. So Tina first.
Yeah, interesting. I looked up, during the session, I looked up Office of National Statistics, what they say about how many people are working class or not, and they agree with David, actually. They have skilled, manual, semi-skilled and unskilled labours, 43%, and they say everybody else, basically 57, is middle class, managerial, professional roles, and clerical roles. They see them all as middle class. When you do ask people, 58% define themselves as working class. So clearly a majority, which I think is really interesting, because they clearly that's how they experience themselves. That's how they experience their work, their alienated way of working. Do as the boss says. You have to, you have to do a job. You might own your own means of production. There's mine, my laptop. Somebody else has a car. Does that mean they're not working class? Well, the thing is, classes are changing dramatically at the moment, isn't it? If you just limit it to industrial working class, it changes your whole strategy about what socialism is. If you think it's the industrial working class that has to run society, you're bound to have an entirely different strategy, which is basically minority rule, or a coalition with the middle classes, or a putsch. You have a totally different strategy. So it's not about definitions. Some people in the chat were saying it's a bit boring, isn't it, the definition of working class? No, it changes, I think, everything. We believe that, we have a majority now. We could take over society now. There is a working class majority. We haven't got an agency, a party that can fight for that, but surely a self-recognition of the majority that they are working class is really important. And if you just limit this to the industrial working class, I think you're doing yourself a huge disfavor, and you're basically making socialism as the rule of the majority impossible. You would have to have some kind of coalition. In terms of sending people into factories, and that's the way to sort of spread the revolution or something. I think what's more likely to happen is that the people you're sending into the factories are changing quite quickly. Because there is a reason, I think, if you look at pictures of our forefathers, Marx, Lenin, not even talking about bloody Engels, these were not sort of the kind of people who had to go down the mine and work 10, 12 hours a day. There is a reason why political parties of the left have a lot of people within it who have a certain amount of time to think and study and organize, etc. Of course, we are taking it seriously that we have to win over the working class and, go to the working class by having a party. That's how we're trying to go to the working class, to present a real political alternative. The working class will build its own defense mechanism and organizations, spontaneously. Our task is to build the kind of party that they can then turn to and reach to. This artificial way of sending people into the industrial, working class, as I say, I think is likely to achieve the opposite. You'll lose those people you've sent in because they have to do jobs that take up all their time. So I think we have to win over the middle classes, of course, etc. But you underestimate, I think, how work has already been changing. That the large sections of the middle classes are becoming proletarianized. They're becoming. The opposite is happening as well, of course. But there is, the working class is not just the blue collar or the pink collar. If you might want to. Add nurses if they're allowed to join your industrial working class or not. But I think you're totally misinterpreting how the working class sees itself. You could be, I'm probably middle class, and lots of people who are in my position. You work from home, you on their computer. I don't see myself as middle class. I own my own means of production. That does not make me middle class. It makes me quite clearly working class, and a lot of van drivers will experience it like that as well. If you work for Amazon, I think some of them own their own car. That does not make them middle class. To the barista, etc. So I think your whole strategy changes if you just look at the industrial working class as the working class, because it forces a minority, the idea of a minority to run society and socialism. That's totally different what we are trying to achieve. Thanks.
Hi, Gabriel. Good to hear you. It's a pity that you haven't got, as far as I know, any other comrades in the room, so it's going to be a bit of a one-sided debate, perhaps, or maybe not. Good. Welcome, comrades. Anyway, look, I don't agree with Mike's the working class is a small majority. I certainly don't agree with Gabriel's it's even smaller. I think in Britain it's a clear majority. That's just really my take on it. I mean, I haven't looked up the statistics, but I mean, as soon as people are saying that people in white-collar jobs are middle class, to use a phrase, what a load of bollocks, you know, and ask me, you know, go out into an office or go out there and say, we are middle class. This is to me, it's a nonsense. Either way, the point is that, you know, what Gabriel describes is of course quite accurate. I find a problem with Mike, you're using the word far left, and you're saying that our job is not to solve the problem of Trotskyist groups, which split because they're attached to the transitional method, right? From their point of view, right, we actually need to break them. I do think, you know, in the same way with the official communists, you know, we actually can learn something from the history of official communism going back to its origins, or if you want, as we do also, learn something about the history of communism from the Second International. And I don't want to get myself into a position of where communists just do the, I don't know, election work, and then we let the trade unionists do the trade union work. To me, the working class needs to be unified, and the way it becomes unified is in a communist party or the fight for a communist party. But the point I would make here is that Gabriel, you described the RCP, the SWP SPU. I think Mike added in the CPB in that, but Gabriel did.
Is it Gabriel? I think that's Vincent.
Oh, I thought you were Gabriel. You're Vincent. Oh. You should have shouted. Okay, well, I don't know. We all use lots of different names. But anyway, my main point is that if we look at the question of organising trade unions, parties can organise trade unions. German social democracy did. You know, we don't just leave it to spontaneity, we can organise that. But the point I would make, Vincent, let's say David now, I'm getting all over the place, aren't I? Look, the point I wanted to make really is, if you can get the left united into something that people take seriously, you win people in industry, you win people in offices, you win the working class, right? So the idea of 5 trots going into industry, and if you think that's going to make one iota of difference, is for the birds. It is a complete nonsense. I don't know whether these 5 comrades, if it was 50, if it was 500, would be changed. I don't know. I don't buy the idea, I just picked up from Tina, that members of the industrial working class don't have time to think. I maybe picked that up from you, I'm not sure. Look, when I joined the CPGB, or the communist movement, I was 13. Right? I joined, right, in a small town, new town, called Hemel Hempstead, overflow town, post-World War II. We had 5 branches in the town. We had industrial branches. We had branches in the college. When I moved to Luton, right, the leader of Vauxhall, in terms of the TNG, was a member of the Communist Party. The leader of the AEU, the more skilled workers, was a member of the Communist Party. Next door in Vauxhall, the leader of the AEU was George Slessor, right? And that was quite typical. I worked as a student in Luton Airport. Who was the convener of Luton Airport? A guy called Harry Harbottle. What was he a member of? The Communist Party. That wasn't people we sent in, right? It was people we won. And then we organised, and we organised into standing elections, both for the council and for Parliament, and also in the union. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't faults with the CPGB. I was a member, I knew the faults. But if we look back to, for example, the formation of the CPGB, it had nothing to do with sending people into industry. We won people who happened to be in industry because of their trade union struggles, but crucially because of their politics. And I'll finish with this one, Vincent. There you are. There you are. There's two guys, one called Marx, one called Engels. They were isolated from the working class, I think, right? What was their solution? To go into industry. Engels did go into industry. Engels did. Right? Just last example on that theme, RSDLP. There you are at the second Congress, the real founding Congress. They have support in the working class, but it isn't because Lenin has got a job, down the road in the steel factory. Martov, he went and got a job on the rails. Or there's Plekhanov. Oh yeah, he got a job in a bakery. No, they won people in steel plants on the railways, right? To the political project through the paper Iskra. Anyway.
Hi, I'm John Ryan. I'll try and be brief, and I'm going to try and kind of be even the time I give to respond to Comrade Vincent and Comrade Mike. The points I'm making are really to do with the point in life where one is definitions, which are a little bit looser than maybe we'd like to think traditionally. It's really what brings to mind the earlier responses from Comrade Vincent. It's more to do with what used to be called blue collar and what used to be called white collar, which to a lot of people is not so clear a distinction today. But to me, the main difference which continues today is that at the end of a working day, whether they leave on their car or on a bus, the formerly known as blue collar worker is more likely to go back to a location where there's maybe more crime, there's more social issues involved, at least on a blatant level, because they affect the so-called nicer areas as well, but it's more visual. You can see people dealing and stuff. On the other side, the people who are maybe seen as formerly white collar will maybe go home to a slightly nicer area in the sense that they're maybe privately owned houses and they're seen as being a nice area, whatever. It goes to me to values. To me, the people who are in these blue-collar neighbourhoods, I would say that they are recovering. They're recovering their muscle strength, but they're recovering from very much political trauma from being beaten so many times. And I think they have suffered more than us who might be seen as on the white-collar side of things. I think they have suffered more. They've suffered more because of campaigns, because of policies, national policies and so forth. But they're getting it back. But it's not for us to tell us, oh, you're finished with your trauma now, so you can go ahead. They will be coming when they can see a clear and concise aim, and when they feel themselves there's a realistic chance of a victory. I think they're sophisticated enough and all that to know that. It was only after I retired, by the way, that I came to the idea that some people didn't consider me to be working class, or I wasn't in a working class. I went through my whole working life not knowing that. It gets back to the point I think Mike has made about holding wages down. That is what's affecting the former white-collar worker now as well. There's this coming together because the training and so forth is in jobs that you're getting more telling, the time management, you're supposed to manage yourself, time management, pressure, targets, reviews, all this is happening all the time. And at the same time, the rent whether it's private rent or whether mortgages, to get a mortgage is so troublesome. I think the issue is about tipping points. You get on tipping points that affect you from time to time, and there'll be people who'll come and fill the, if you like to say, the empty chairs, be it in the Communist Party or in individual left-wing groups. They'll come when they're ready and when they've got over a certain amount of trauma and they're energised, where there's a clear road ahead. And we're certainly, any group I was ever involved is waiting to have this happen. It's not a question about putting one's blue shirt on and going into an area and saying, you know, I can achieve things there by voluntarily going into that neighbourhood, because the people there are well known of their own ideas. And the whole thing about white collar, an idea came to me about a book I read years ago. The idea of when you have a group of people, a set, and it's just an example, it's not a socialist example, how you meet a problem once it's analysed and it's assessed. Back in the 1850s, the Quakers did a study of their own membership, and they were having problems. People were saying back that old people that they knew were kind of struggling a bit. Families were having problems looking over a lot of older people, and they were saying, so why is this? You know, Quakers aren't poor people really. So what they found out was that they did a very strategic study, and they found out that the average Quaker at the time was living 3 years longer than the national average. And partly it was because they had slightly better income, but also maybe there may be issues to do with, you know, nourishment, lifestyle choices and so forth, and, you know, not drinking as much. So that led to the formation of Friends Provident, which was a well-known insurance company, and it was there for the set of people involved, and it was only in about 20 years ago that it got bought out and became a more mainstream. Getting back to the difference, I'll finish on this. So you've got, for instance, a surgeon. A surgeon could be a big land speculator or big owner of rent and so forth. On the other hand, few people would deny that the first year's probated doctor in a hospital almost falling asleep with stress is in a different situation. And also, you know, when you have people who sign themselves up for being a hero of neoliberal capitalism, they can, you know, excommunicate themselves from working class, if you like. But apart from that, you know, we are in it together, I think. Thanks.
I don't think we have time for everyone, but we have back here.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I want to just come back to what I think is really the main question is, how do you overcome the divide between the working class and the left? And I think that's kind of really a question that's not really been addressed at all. Okay, in terms of Mike Macnair's arguments, he made very little arguments that actually related to this kind of key question, except one which I'll get to after. But one of his main arguments he made against Vincent's presentation is that he gave the examples of unions where communists actually won the leadership of strategic unions and where the state intervened. And that's his example to show that it's a bad strategy to actually try to win strategic unions. But actually, it proves exactly the opposite, that the capitalist state itself considers it an absolute red line for communists to, you know, control these strategic industries. Actually, so it really proves the opposite, that this is like really crucial positions to win. The state recognizes as much. Then I think throughout the discussion, there's just this constant counterposition that is totally false between doing trade union work and doing political work, winning the working class to political notions. But don't you think if the working class experiences the state taking over its union, that it won't help them learn broader lessons, broader communist lessons about the nature and the role of the state? It's just totally false to put these two things on parallel channels. Same thing. Don't you think that by being in the union, communists can also help raise the consciousness of the working class, bringing broader political issues to them? Now, okay, I thought Jack Conrad's remarks were a little bit more thoughtful in many ways, but you know, at least acknowledging the importance of building the trade unions for communists. But how are you going to win people to the trade unions if communists are not in any way in contact with the working class? How are we going to come into contact with the working class? Obviously, what we do want to do is win communist leaders in the working class. But how are you going to win these initial cadres if you're totally divorced from the working class and have no perspective of actually going to reach these comrades? It's not like that you'll send a few communists and that will, in the trade unions, and suddenly that will solve the whole problem. It's to build these initial positions, which the British far left does not even have at this point. By the way, I'm Gabriel, and maybe it's particularly confusing because we're wearing the same color shirt today. But apparently people can't tell the difference between the two of us. Then I think a lot of comrades are just totally caricaturing our position, you know, as if we're saying that every single member of every group should go and become a worker. Oh, that Engels was not a worker, and so on. This is a total caricature. That's not at all what we're arguing. Also, there's another, comrades seem to think that we're basically spitting, or that it's somehow a moral attack on other layers of the working class, because we recognize that there's a difference in strategic power between different sectors of workers. That's just an obvious fact. The one argument that Mike Macnair does make is about the unity of the left, that the reason the communists don't have much influence in the working class is because the left is divided. Now, that is true. That is a problem, and that is a factor. But again, why is that like totally counterposed? Why is uniting the left counterposed to doing trade union work and uniting the left? Actually, in our view, having communists that are organized often in similar trade unions, working together, actual unity and action in the class struggle is actually one of the main ways we're going to unite the communist movement, by actually fighting together side by side to advance the interests of the working class in concrete ways. The last point I want to make is just a bit of a historic point and a bit of a response to Tina, but the Russian Revolution, had a vanguard sector, in the Putilov factories, in the industrial districts. Those were really the front lines of the working class. And I was also a bit shocked by her, her question about, should you have like a coalition government? But like the Russian Revolution established exactly that. It was a workers' government in alliance with the peasantry. It was these vanguard sectors of the working class which were able to rally all the other oppressed layers of Russia, and including the majority of population in that case, which was the peasantry. So I think there's a lot of moralism, and I think a lot of just kind of falsifying what the actual kind of real substance of the debate is. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
No, he's not talking about you. He's talking about the smarts.
Ready?
Yep.
My points are only really in response to.
Can you speak up, please? I have to change the batteries.
I'll speak up a bit. So my points are only really in response to Vincent, so apologies for the lack of balance there. I think Vincent was right to say that that with the sects that do have a lot of people active in trade unions, they still, through that work, don't necessarily reach the working class, the rank and file of the trade unions. To that point, I can remember when I was in the SWP, I had a very close friendship with somebody in the Socialist Party, and we would get together and talk politics, and even horrifyingly, I would go to Socialist Party meetings because I thought, why not? And the people in the SWP would tell me, you really shouldn't be doing that. You work together on trade union issues, and I've heard that excuse. I think it is an excuse for sectarianism. That's all it is really, and I think it speaks to Mike's point about how our lack of unity is part of this divorce from the working class. I think that the idea of sending communists into workplaces I'm very interested in it. I've never really thought about it seriously, but I think there's something slightly old-fashioned about this idea in that the mass workplace isn't what it used to be. There obviously are mass workplaces. One would be something like an Amazon warehouse. If I was part of an organisation and they told me to work in one of those, I'd tell them to fuck off. I'm not doing it. They sound awful. Another could be a hospital, but again, those workplaces are less democratic and there's more surveillance than there ever has been. So I'm not sure. So not sure about this obsession with factories. Maybe it's a local variation, whatever, but I don't know anyone that works in a factory. I can think of one near where I work, but mostly it's buildings that used to be factories, older friends and older co-workers. A lot of them used to work in factories that closed down. I don't think that's as relevant as it used to be. Interested in the idea that work is important for learning discipline, and then that ends up being useful for your political work and your political development. I think it can. I think you can also learn anti-racism at work and unlearn what you learn from your parents often. But you can also learn a lot of shit from work that doesn't help you. I think my first jobs were in a shop. You learn customer service, which is basically lying, is learning how to bullshit people. I don't think that's very helpful. You're forced in workplaces often to compete with your fellow workers as well. And you gain a lot of bad things, you know, physical injury, exhaustion. In my case, certainly mental illness from the way that work grinds you down. I've been convinced as a Marxist for about 15 years. I doubt if I could string 15 days together, and I've actually been politically effective in that time, and we all have responsibility for ourselves, but I would put that down basically to to work. So yeah, I wouldn't completely dismiss it, but I'm very sceptical about this idea of sending comrades to workplaces.
Thanks, comrades. I find the idea completely alien to my experience. I mean, I joined a communist youth league when I was 14. One of the first things they did, they took us down a mine that the communists ran and said, "This is our mine." And I mean, and I'm not trying to do a more prolier than thou, but my father was a factory worker, and he basically said, "Never fucking work in a factory." I mean, and because he was one to communism to raise the working class culturally out of the absolute dredge of industrial labour. And that should be central to our vision. I think Comrade Vincent's, it was a useful contribution because of how fundamentally wrong it was. And it's like a chemically pure expression of a lot of what is wrong with the entire Marxist left, as far as I'm concerned. I think it reflects a fundamental petty bourgeois approach to politics, projecting middle-class political fantasies of the horny-handed sons of toil, and that revolutionary consciousness spontaneously arises just because of where you happen to be in the labour process. What a load of bullshit that is. And I know people who've gone through interns to industry from the Mandalites, from different groups, and it fucks people's lives up. It destroys organisations. And I think that it was a real giveaway that the Sparts admit they do it to discipline their own members. Go and get a job in a factory and we'll wash that lily-livered middle-class bullshit out of you. Come on, comrades, be serious. It's just completely unserious approach to mass politics. Trade union activity and consciousness is the lowest form of working class consciousness. We know that. But because of how isolated we are from the workers' movement at the moment as communists, every middle class trot sect that you meet, they have a fantasy about being trade unionists. And I mean, it is, I just treat it as a joke. And I thought your presentation was a joke. It treats workers like babes in the wood. Just the presence of a few trots the scales will fall from the eyes of the working class and they realize, oh, I'm actually a communist. I think it is completely unserious. And it was confused. You talk about vast subcontracting. Subcontractors are completely alien, individual workers in many ways. They're not working in big collective areas. I think you recognise the point. I mean, why bother with the CPGB or Communist Unity or anyone else? Just go and do it. If it's the strategy that's going to work, why bother being in this meeting? You should just go down to the factory gates and start recruiting workers. I think the fact that you recognise that recruitment is needed shows that the working class needs a political project. And also, in terms of, the whole barista thing, the example of the Communist Party of the USA in the 1930s in Detroit, they used something like social unionism, combining anti-racist agitation, women's liberation agitation, unemployment agitation, local council elections to develop a social unionism that turned Detroit from an anti-union town into a union town. And it wasn't just by sending people into factories, they organised politically as a party. My jaw did drop when you said that the working class was a minority in Britain, and I thought, well, that's just a game away for me. Just pack up and go home, I think. And I think there was a distinction between Vincent and Gabrielle. Yes, there's a differentiation of strategic power between workers. If you control the waterfront, it's different to if you control every coffee shop in London. I accept that. But that is not what Vincent was saying. Vincent was saying that baristas are not workers. They're not working class. And I think that there's a difference between you, comrades. So I think sort your own house out and come back when you're serious.
I think it's very dangerous to assume that political consciousness arrives from being in a factory or in a production area. That's a very economistic way of looking at things, but also in reality, people gain political consciousness for all sorts of reasons, including international situations, wars, their own struggles, and a political situation in a country. So, very dangerous. Around 7 to 8% of the British working class can be classified blue collar in the strictest term meaning of it. And even that's overestimated. If we include construction workers, you might get to 10%. 80% of the working class is in the service industry in this country, and that's true of most of Europe. And in the service industry, you don't have a single industry where you can organize. So you've got contractors, you've got very small companies, you've got subcontractors, and you've got the gig worker, the Uber driver, the person who, as Tina said, owns their own laptop and works at home. In such a situation, the idea that sending people into factories would make a difference is unbelievable. I just can't see the practical result of anything like that. But there are other issues. So first of all, the experience of all such previous attempts, not just the IMG, shows the fact that the working class recognizes these interests, so to speak, and realizes that these people are there temporarily. The rest of the working class considers these people as if they're on holiday. They will be going, they're not there in long term. There is also a level of substitutionism. Instead of building the working class from and having cadres that are consciously becoming activists because of their own struggle, you are actually implanting people there. And if you have a strike, the factory owner or the owner of that industry would immediately blame, the first things they would do is blame the outsiders. It's not our genuine workers, they all love us, they all love being exploited. It's these people, these outsiders who have come. And to think that you will not be identified as outsiders is impossible. Anyone who's done this knows that as soon as you go in, you are identified as outsiders. So on the whole, I don't see this as a viable, serious project. And I think comrades should reconsider. It might be a nice novel idea because maybe we've run out of other ideas, but let's be a bit more serious.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more comrades. I think one online and then one more in the room. So, is it Alan?
Yeah, just have to change the setting. Hold on.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Alan, yeah.
Okay. Few comments on this. I think generally that to the extent I had to choose a side, it would be with the Spartacist League. But I have a question. My first question is to Vincent. You used the terms working class and middle class repeatedly in your presentation, but you didn't define them. So I'd be interested in knowing, at least in a quick description of how you're using those terms. Also, I thought that Gabriel made a good point about what I thought many of the CPGB interventions seemed to be about, which was a false dichotomy, an either or. I don't think that the Spartacist League is suggesting that. I might have some criticism about whether they have got to being a large enough group for it to be something that pays off, but certainly strategically I agree with them. This is something you want to do. And the CPGB comrades seem to be very dismissive of the role of Marxists working within their workplaces. I'm here assuming that we're workers and unions where they exist where we're working, and if not, we're trying to build a union. Because we're all interested in the class struggle and the final manifestation of that in the class struggle reaching such a level that it allows for a revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. But a very powerful component of the class struggle, not the only one, but certainly a powerful component, is the ability to withdraw labour in workplaces. And not only that, about being able to withdraw your labour, and that being an important tool. That's in terms of both fighting for the interests of the working class in the here and now, which I would hope that Marxists thought was of some importance. But also, of course, such mass withdrawal of labour can be an important tool in revolutionary situations. And it's not something that can easily be turned on and off. Certainly, I can't remember which CPGB has said, well, we're going to recruit people to our Communist Party we're building without any conscious intervention into the organised workplaces of the working class, which seemed to be the message I was getting. And I think it misses another thing as well, is that which I think is very important, I know the CPGB don't think it's so important, is the potential for building organisations of proletarian struggle, which, at least in their are proto-forms of higher forms of proletarian democracy, which are going to be very important as working class struggle gets to a higher level, and obviously is the training ground for the new forms of the post-capitalism, the new forms of state in the process of withering away. one thing that I think also a bit towards the Spartacist League, you talked about industrial working class. I think you want to be careful about that. I preferred when you talked about strategic sections of the working class, because in the current situation, I would think that to the extent that you're an organisation which is able to do planned implantations into particular workplaces to try and build the beginnings of caucuses and so on.
Could you start winding up, please?
Yep. The communications and IT industries, which are not traditionally seen as industrial, I think are very important for any work of this nature. And I'll finish there.
Hi, yeah, great to hear you both. Now, I'm really new to this subject, so I can't quote any theory, but I thought it'd be really relevant to come in because you're talking about sort of sending people into the workplaces and talking about unions and sort of, yeah, well, my experience is I would very much call myself working class, and you mentioned about nurses. Now, I'm a mental health nurse, and I have recently joined a union, become a union rep. So just kind of wanted to say a bit about my experience. It really relates to what Mike was saying, Jack was saying. So, you know, I was asked to become a union rep. So I've been working inside the organisation, but I was asked to be a union rep because of the interest I started showing into communism, because of being introduced to it by someone who was speaking here, Ted Rees, at the weekend. So my experience is kind of, it's the idea of sort of sending people in to organisations. In a way, it sounds quite nice or quite good, but for me, it's very much getting people in the organisations and getting people enthused about getting involved in, you know, movement. And like, so for example, you know, I've become a union rep because they're going to cut 330 jobs from my trust. Now that is indicative of capitalism, you know, government debt. You know, my trust isn't actually in debt because I've done the research. Who's in debt is the government, and that's filtering down. And as a consequence, I've become more interested through reading and getting interested in communism, and you know, and in terms of you know, being inside the organisation and doing and getting involved, you know, we are doing a lot. You know, we're proposing a strike. We're starting a ballot in a couple of weeks. We're doing a demo, if anyone's around, 20th of August. Demos across all three sides. But in terms of communism and the movement, for me, it's great doing stuff in work because that's where I'm getting my kind of passion for it. But for me, I need to understand more in like the politics of exactly what Mike was saying. Sorry, I can't think of the jargon because I'm so inexperienced. But when you spoke about, you know, ideology, political movements, Jack was saying as well. So for me, it's very much about, I'm so new in this journey that I need to learn, I need to educate myself so that I can then take it into the workplace, and I can spread it to my colleagues. Because, you know, as Jack was saying in the talk before, alluding to it, you know, communism is a dirty word. Socialism, not so much, but it's a dirty word. You can't, you know, you can't, when I talk about it with my friends, with my colleagues, they're like, oh no, do you not know about the Soviet Union? You know, and so it's really about re-education as well as kind of movements in the workplace. So.
Thank you very much for that interesting discussion from the floor. I think we're going to take Vincent first now to get back in line.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me? Can somebody just do a thumbs up? Yeah, okay, good. Right. Okay, lots to say. I'm not from Britain. But I've been living in Britain for a few years, and I've always noticed how there's something quite personal about when you talk about class. I do think that the working class is not the majority in Britain. We can debate this maybe another day exactly, but however, I've met a lot of people who are clearly not working class, you know, who are really high paid, yet who still think they are working class. So you have to distinguish between a bit how people view themselves or where they're from and with their job, because at the end of the day, classes are defined by your relationships to the means of production. It's what defines working class, middle class, and ruling class. Where to start exactly? There's been a lot of falsification of our views in that discussion. I think Comrade Gabriel addressed it, and a lot of moralism. It's a moral thing. It's like I'm spitting on other layers. All I've argued really is that communists should have a conscious orientations to the strategic sectors of the proletariat, the industrial working class in particular. When I say industrial working class, I include IT, I include the layers of subcontracting. They do exist. I don't know. We have a friend, for example, who does maintenance on the rail. The entire rail system in the UK is subcontractors, and you have to go there. You have to have a conscious orientation to reach those workers. There's been a lot of comrades are talking about building a communist party. What's needed is to build a communist party. There's something totally idealist in the CPGB conception about how to build a communist party. It's like, oh, the organizing and the union aspect of things is going to happen sort of spontaneously. Our job is to build a party. Well, why would worker follow a party if other than if they see it as essential to advance their own interests and their own livelihood? There's really a strict, rigid division that the CPGB creates between the economic struggle and the political struggle, which is totally counterproductive to win over any workers. The workers are going to be won to communism because they can see that their own liberation and their own advancement in terms of material condition requires communism. There's something totally idealist in how comrades are arguing it. Jack Conrad, of course we want to win workers. We're not saying we're just going to send people, and of course we want to win workers. But what everybody kind of avoids in the discussion is what I describe as the context. The far left is divorced from the working class. Comrade Macnair agrees with this. Most workers see the left as a bunch of middle-class, pretentious liberals. This is how most workers see the far left. So what do we do to change that? Now, I've got a lot of shit against what I'm proposing to go to the workers, yet I've heard zero solution about this. And the reason why also I'm a bit going against about this notion that everybody's a worker is because it becomes an excuse not to change that situation. If everybody is a worker, then we don't need to change anything. Well, no, actually, we need to change the social composition of the left. The left is made up of middle class, students, retirees in majority. I know it's not overall, but in majority. That needs to change. How do we change this? No one has answered this. No one. The question of a few trots going to industry is not going to change anything. We're not stupid. We know that sending a few people is not going to be a sea change. We did, however, made a proposal to the RCP, for example. The RCP claims to have 1,300 members. We propose, how about you send 600 to 700 of them in jobs where there are trade unions, or in working class job, even non-union. That is a critical force that can make a difference in the balance of the class struggle. There's really a fatalism in the position of the CPGB that individuals fighting cannot change anything, doesn't matter. Actually, what we find out in our little work in the working class in the trade unions, where we do send people and where we also have people that are from those industries, is that the trade union movement is so hollowed out, the bureaucracy is so rotten, that when you actually try to wage a fight, sometimes you can win. And people see, oh, that's what a union is supposed to do. That's what some of the things we tried to do. That's obviously totally dismissed by many comrades. In particular, I think it's Marcus, its name, the comrade with the red shirt, a totally demagogic intervention, totally distorted what we said. We have never argued that political consciousness comes from being in a factory. That's not what I argued. We do not think that because you're in a factory, you have good consciousness. What we have argued, however, is that middle-class petty bourgeois ideas do dominate the left, and it will help to fight that if the left is more made up of people who are actually in working class jobs. I never said that this is to discipline our members. What I've said is when you have organizations made up of middle class and petit bourgeois elements who have petit bourgeois life and outlook, it's kind of a good training to put them into a working class job. They learn how to work with their hands. They learn discipline. They learn to get up in the morning. That's what I meant. That's just good life skills and important to be a communist. I would just on the question of a workers need collective action. A lot of people, or Mike Macnair has talked about this. Look, yes, workers need collective action. The main obstacle to collective action is the union bureaucracy. They're the ones, maintaining the unions weak. They're the ones blocking real industrial action needed. They're the ones really weakening the trade union movement. Well, part of our understanding of really focusing on the working class, sending people there and winning over people in those industries is to fight the union bureaucracy. It's to organize that struggle. We think it is key. The key task of communists is to guide the struggle of workers. And by the way, we do have committees of nurses, we have committees of teachers as well. We do work in all areas, in all layers, everywhere there's a need to struggle. But according to the CPGB's conception, the role of the Communist Party isn't to guide the day-to-day struggle of the workers, like to go on strike or for wages. I think Mike Macnair was quite explicit in certain events and other articles where he said that the role of the Communist Party isn't to guide the day-to-day struggle. The role is like political more broadly. There's this strict separation, which is really, really counterproductive here. Like the comrade who spoke, the nurse who spoke, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. You have a strike and a ballot going on and 300 people being laid off. Well, I'd like to reach out to you because this is the kind of struggle that communists should really get involved in and should really seek to propose a communist strategy to fight this. But the CPGB's political outlook really creates a distinction between the communist program and the program that's needed to fight those 300 layoffs. We disagree. We think they're the same. They go together, hand in hand. What else to say? I think that's pretty much it. Look, I'll just conclude on a brief thought. And again, what motivates us in the Spartacist League isn't it's not a fetishism or something, but it's really, we see it as very dangerous, the position of the left right now. We're getting into a situation where the right is growing, the state is becoming more repressive, and the far left is largely divorced from the working class, the class it is supposed to represent. So this is a problem we need to solve. And yes, we think that sending people into industry is not going to solve everything, but it's going to help. Because one thing I would say is that also when repression comes, roots in the working class is the best way to fight it. If you're just sort of standing in midair with a mainly middle class composition, it will be much harder to resist brutal shocks that are coming. And so I think I'll leave it here. But really, what I want comrades to get, it's not that we're spitting on other layers. We think we support the struggles of every single layers. But we do insist that the far left must consciously break with this problem of being based in the middle class and must realize that this influences the ideas of the far left and also how workers see the far left or the communist movement, whatever you want to call it. This is a real problem. And I have yet to hear any serious solution to this problem, only bashing of our proposal, which, by the way, is quite basic. Send middle-class kids into working-class jobs. How is that petit bourgeois? How is that a joke, Mr. King of Demagogy with the red T-shirt? Like this what do you mean? So I'll stop here.
Okay. There is a need for collective action. The need for collective action is not only trade unions, nor is it the case that trade unions on their own can win. nor is it the case that trade unionism in strategic sectors on its own can win. And that was my point, simply in relation to the electricians' union, the Minneapolis, the Trotskyist leadership in Cowley, which I knew firsthand, the Trotskyist leadership in Cowley. The problem is, because you conduct sectional struggles, it's right to conduct sectional struggles. It's not conduct sectional struggles, but you need, as well as the sectional struggles, you need the political action which leads masses of people who are not immediately in struggle to understand that when the judiciary rule against the trade union, that's a class act. That when the newspapers denounce the trade, for example, newspapers have spent an enormous amount of effort denouncing the junior doctors, the hospital resident doctors, as overpaid, selfish, holding the country to ransom, etc., etc. You need a struggle for an alternative press. You need a struggle for an alternative electoral representation. You need a political voice, and that political voice does not arise solely. It's not enough. Yes, you do political work in your trade union. Yeah. Yes, you do political work in the context of strike actions which occur, but victory is going to require a political action on a larger scale. And it's the fundamental error of the transitional method to imagine that you can leap over the need for political action, for struggles at the level of political parties, electoral representation, struggles for general laws, that you can leap over that directly from strike action to Soviets. If it were the case that this was the phenomenon of the left being isolated from the workers' movement, or at least, let's put it, the far left, I say the far left being isolated from the workers' movement, was a new problem which had arisen recently as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union, then perhaps the argument that the Spartacist comrades were putting forward would be a plausible argument. But as I said, actually, if we go beyond, as opposed to the communist parties, which really did, as Jack said, the communist parties actually won substantial forces in the trade union movement. They won substantial forces in the trade union movement, not because they went and sent their student membership into industrial work, but because they did political work which resulted in trade unionists coming to the communist parties. And in point of fact, that is actually, surprise, surprise, that is actually how the Socialist Labour League won the leadership in the Cowley car factory. My issue about the industrial colonisation proposal is that this is not a new proposal for a new situation. It's an old proposal, which is James P. Cannon's proposal for proletarianising the Socialist Workers' Party and getting rid of what he thought were petty bourgeois ideas in the Shachtmanite opposition, which 4 or 5 years later, it's quite clear that the Shachtmanite Workers' Party had as many members in the industrial unions as the SWP had. And then that idea that you proletarianise, it's been resurfaced in American Maoism, resurfaced in the Mandelites, resurfaced in the IMG. I don't think I'm going to blame Le Toufrière, because Le Toufrière, their politics has always been political intervention with, it's an economistic intervention, but it's an intervention from outside, not we send guys into the plant, as far as I know. Yeah. I say this simply because I know the guys who tried to do work in the Cowley car plant from outside. I don't know whether some of them may be in, it's another matter. But this industrial colonisation, it's a quack remedy which resurfaces from time to time in the Maoist and Trotskyist left, and it resurfaces in the Maoist and Trotskyist left because these organisations are separated from the working class movement. They're separated from the working class movement because they're sectarian splinter operations, which, as a consequence of being sectarian splinter operations, are unable to be effective enough politically to win forces politically to win forces to their political ideas. And the idea that we think that everybody is working class, or that I think that everybody is working class, I've written and in fact referred to in the literary exchanges 2 articles on class composition of the British working class using the official statistics. I come to the conclusion, as other comments, that actually the self-identification largely does work. That people, between 50 and 60% of people self-identify as working class. That does work in essence because actually there's precisely because this country is a tax haven with a moderately sized productive economy attached to it. It also has large unproductive classes, and in particular actually has a large petit rentier class of people who live off, people who are not large-scale rentiers, but who live off investments, including actually people on private pensions who are on good private pensions, funded by investments. So I'm not saying that there isn't a problem of separation of the left from the working class. I'm saying that it's a strategic delusion, it's a tactical delusion to suppose that the industrial colonisation project, and yes, comrades do, it's not exactly that, well, Cowley, when I was there, certainly they regarded the Trots who came in as opposed to the Trots who were recruited out of the plant as being tourists. But there was a whole load of other people. It wasn't such a big deal because, like, a guy who worked 2 stations down from me was a Mauritian doctor who the NHS wouldn't employ him as a doctor because he didn't have an English qualification. So he went and worked in the car plant. There was a whole load of guys who were skilled tradesmen in the building trade who went and worked in the car plant during the winter, and in the summer they went and worked in the building trades. So you see, that factory had the character that being a tourist wasn't a big deal. But certainly the case, people were regarded as this is a sort of political tourism. The main obstacle to collective action is the union bureaucracy, is, I think, delusional. It's just not recognising the extent to which the defeats of the movement in the last 30 years have resulted in hollowing out the union organisations. And okay, yes, it's true that the union bureaucracy has played a significant role in hollowing out but to a very large extent, actually, it's the Wilson government's Trade Union and Labour Relations Act 1974, the Employment Protection Consolidation Act 1974, which judicialised industrial relations. Okay, that fitted with the work of the trade union bureaucracy, the preferences of the trade union bureaucracy. But the effect is that actually when the bureaucracy do want to do something, they have difficulty in getting the membership out. It's not a simple question that the bureaucracy is stopping the membership coming out. Rank and file militancy will do the job. It's, again, it's, how shall I put it, it's Trotskyist, because it's not just the Spartacists. The Spartacists are the ones who've come up with this time round. It's the Spartans who've come up with the idea of industrial colonisation is the solution to the marginality of the far left by getting people proletarianising. This time round, as I say, before that, it was the Maoists in the 70s in the US, then the Barnesites in the 80s in the US. The IMG was about the same period. I was in between. The IMG had its first turn to industry in 1972-73, and its second turn to industry in 1981-82. And I was in Cowley because I've been on the dole for a year and I wanted money. And because it was a reasonably good place to work, because it had political life, because the branch had a Trotskyist leadership. So it was sort of, hey, it's an interesting place to work. I worked in Metal Box at Hackney in 1981, and that was industrial work. That was virtuously taking the turn, but it was completely politically useless because it was a small factory with running very old machines and so on and so forth. So it's political. There's horses for courses in terms of people taking political jobs, but it's illusory to imagine, perfectly reasonable for people to say, okay, it makes sense to take a job in the hospitals because it's got a trade union and political life in the hospital. And it makes more sense to do that than to work in a place like Metal Box. It doesn't make sense to say we want to get people into jobs in strategic industries because the strategic industries will bring the capital to its knees. That's what Arthur Scargill thought his guys would do in 1984-85. You need common action of the working class across industries, not sectional, and not just in industry, in politics, in the cities as a whole. It's the road to that is the unification of the left, and not just we face outward to the masses, whether it's we face outward to the masses in street SWB style, or we face outward to the masses if we send people into factories. That's it.
Thank you very much, Vincent and Mike, for those presentations. We'll be back here at 6 o'clock for Darko Days 2, presentation of Poetry and Parables by Darko Souvenir.